Well, hello. I'm Kurt
Good morning.
Doolittle from the Natural Law Institute. I have my friend here, author Luke Weinhagen. We are going through his book, The Primal Primer. We're covering chapter 12 today. I think if you've been watching the series, I always start out with the basic questions, which is where does this chapter sit in the hierarchy of chapters? In other words, because there's a goal you're trying to get at. And then what are you trying to get? What do you want the audience to take away from this chapter?
Right. Right. So the chapter 12 is about biometrics. And the way I frame it is how your body tries to save your life. Right. So biometrics describes
How
the
your body tries to save your life. I like
right.
that.
Yeah.
Just despite the human brain that
Yep.
you're running around with, it's
Exactly.
questionably
Exactly.
capable at any moment in time.
Well, that's just it. Your brain, your midbrain, your autonomic nervous system, your limbic system, it's taking in way more signals than your frontal lobe, your cortex, your conscious brain can ever process effectively.
Well,
Right.
you
So
can't.
you're
It can't select what to act upon.
right.
Right?
Right.
That's it.
Exactly.
That's your thalamus's problem. What do
Right.
I of all this stuff that's going on? What needs attention?
Right. Right. And because we've created such an environment of safety, we've really desensitized ourselves to the threat signals that our brain is receiving. Right. But our body hasn't. Right. Our conscious mind has, but our body hasn't. Right. And so for the frame of biometrics, what I'm talking about here, why I say
Does that
how
apply like when
your
I see
body.
hot girls? Because I think
Exactly.
that
Yep.
might be.
Exactly. It's that same thing that gets triggered, right? And that's what even encourages you to look in that direction, as your
Yes.
brain picked up a signal and it saw a potential resource and it drew your attention to it, right? But that's what I'm talking about with this when I say how your body tries to save your life is you're receiving all these signals, You're not processing them consciously, but you're still receiving. Your brain is still receiving them, and your body starts to respond to any threat signal it picks up. It starts to dump adrenaline into your system. It starts to dump dopamine into your system. It starts to dump cortisol into your system. And those produce physiological changes in your body. Right. And so even if you're not consciously processing a signal, you can still, by paying attention to your own biometric responses, you can recognize when your brain has triggered a threat signal. And so you can, just by paying attention to how you feel, you can you can pick up on threat signals that you otherwise aren't consciously aware of, right? And we can use that as part of our mechanism in our whole map of situational awareness and behavioral analysis, right? So it's not
Okay.
so biometrics, because it's autonomic responses. One, it gives us the opportunity to read those responses in others, right? Because
Yes.
they can't control them either. Their body are responding to the signals as well, right? So their autonomic nervous system is responding to signals just like ours does. So we can read those in others, but it also gives us an extra tool, a last ditch effort for our body to try to save ourselves and pick up on that signal that's coming in that our limbic system is recognizing as a potential threat and is asking us to key in on and is prepping our body for the confrontation of that threat.
Mhm.
Right? But our conscious mind is not yet aware of it. We can start to pick up on the changes in our physiology, in our biometric responses, and use that to look for the threat signal that our brain is picking up on. Right. So it's kind of a twofold tool here. It becomes really effective as you practice it and practice
Well,
being aware of it.
so in your book, your goal is to, I'm going to say it is develop basic human competence to get you in touch with the universe, right? So that you feel that you achieve mindfulness, right?
Yes.
So that you can select among these things, and partly so that you're more independent and less and have more agency rather than being a subject or victim
Right. Right. Yes.
of others because you lack basic human competence. So what you're saying is there's a very human level of education
Yes.
that the informational density of modernity is eradicating from us, like our history is being eradicated from
Correct.
us, our culture.
Yes. Yes.
And so you're trying to restore that basic human
And
competence our generations have, but it seems like the younger ones don't have anymore. Don't have basic human competence anymore. They
and,
can't.
and,
They don't know that nature's putting limits on them.
right. And that's my concern. As we eradicate that competence, my major concern is that becomes fatal to us as a species, right?
Mhm.
Because what it means is we can no longer successfully navigate reality, because we're no longer in contact with reality.
Okay, so your you have two basic threads that you toggle back and forth in the
Yes.
book,
Yes.
and one of them is this what do you call it? Situational awareness.
Yeah, it's the domain of situational awareness and behavioral analysis.
And so you said this is the most granular level.
Yeah, this is the
Trying to
highest
get-
fidelity level. It's kind of, so we start off broadly looking at the entire environment. We call that atmospherics. And we're looking for atmospheric shifts in the environment, that any kind of deviation from the expectations of the environment, which I call the baseline. We're always building baselines so that we can identify anomalies or deviations from those baselines, right? So we start off at atmospherics. We're looking at the entire environment that we're in. And then from there, if we pick up any kind of deviation, we start dialing down on that deviation. We look for what I call proxemic violations. So how are people moving through that space, or how are they interacting with that space? How are they positioning themselves within that space? And that's the field of proxemics. So we're looking for, again, deviations from that baseline, anomalies that emerge out of the baseline that we're establishing, the expectations that we have in that environment. If we pick up on any anomalies there, then we focus in more on what those sources of anomalies are, and we start looking for kinetic slips, which are nonverbal communication cues that represent deviations from anomalies, right? Where we're looking for things that don't align with our expectations of behaviors in those environments. Now, if we pick up on any kinetic slips, then we have another tool available to us in the biometrics. We can isolate or identify whatever is the source of the kinetic slip and look at them more closely and say, are they presenting any biometric evidence of issues, of internal conflict, of anything that's manifesting, anything that's stressing their system that would produce a physiological change, right? So what we're doing is we're dialing in all the way down to the individual, past nonverbal communications into autonomic responses to the stresses that the individual is under, and we're reading everything along that process, right? And then we're also, what I'm suggesting here is that we shift that same thing onto ourselves in this process, and so that we can identify, is our system picking up something that we're not even picking up yet, right? So we go from an overall atmospheric view to identifying specific threats, to turning that whole tool set onto ourselves to see, have we missed anything in that whole process?
Mhm.
So that's what that whole approach does. Is it provides a complete, from complete externality to complete internality set of tools to apply in threat assessment,
Mhm.
right? And I provide those tools in the book to facilitate that. Again, just to refer back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? That second level of the physiological needs is safety and security, right? So
Yeah,
this is
so
my answer.
yes, and I always try to compensate for this because uh there's a wrong way to interpret your work, right? Right. And I don't like that wrong interpretation of it.
Sure.
And you got to realize, Luke chose this framing on purpose, right? For it's partly marketing reasons, right? Right, but partly to give something was tangible for people to touch.
Yes.
But what he's really trying to do is make you have mindfulness, because you have confidence, because you have competence, because you're not ignorant, because you have the tools you use to
Yes.
be a basic human being existing in the natural world, despite all these social, political, economic, and whatever other informational signals that are floating around trying to seize your attention and God knows do what to you. So
Right.
I always look at this and I'm like, yeah, because I'm not a very scared person, all right? And so I'm like, that's don't misunderstand what Luke's telling you here, right? I mean, he's using this threat response because he wants you to be aware of how to overcome those, to build the confidence, to be able to have mindfulness so that you aren't manipulable or suggestible by people with less virtuous ambitions than Luke has.
Yeah. Yeah.
Did I do okay with that? I just want to make sure I did okay with that.
No, that's crystal clear, and that's exactly my goal. And I use the tools that I use in the book, and I offer the lessons that I offer in the book to facilitate that development.
Yes.
Right, and in the process, it reestablishes that connection to
Well, you know,
that
well, look, you could have
humanity.
written
So
this book totally unappealing to men by making it to saying the same things in some woo-woo spiritualistic sort of
yes,
manner.
yeah,
Right.
but that would
I
be
just I
irresponsible.
want to flip it around and say he could have written it another way, which would have been totally uninteresting, and you
Yeah,
never looked at
right,
it. But
right.
by writing it this way, it makes it so a man will look at it.
Well, and not only that, but because of the way I put it together, all of these things are practicable. There are things you can implement. There's steps you can take, and in the taking of those steps, in the practice of the lessons, you're developing the competence. Your brain is changing, right? I mean, the way you interpret signals is changing. The way you recognize threats is changing in the practice of this material. So it's not just that you're reading a self-help book or something like that, and you come out of the other end of it with a slightly different understanding of the processes in play. What I'm actually trying to do is put you through a series of exercises that facilitate that development step by step. Right? I'm just not identifying that as the process of the book, right? But that's what I'm accomplishing for anyone that actually works their way through the material. Right? Is
Yes,
they're rebuilding that facilitation of being in a position to express mindfulness.
yes,
Right?
which
So
is the
that's
goal, right? I mean,
right. That is the goal. I want to, I want on behalf of my children, I want to preserve our opportunity for cooperation in the future.
that's what all of the whole team does, right? I mean,
Right, exactly. Right. We seem, we seem very conflict motivated to the outsider, but our entire goal is the facilitation of
for
cooperation
cooperation.
and the
Right.
maximization of the optimum effects of cooperation. And
Mhm.
that's really what we're all working on here as a group and as an organization.
You're talking about conflict and individualism. No, we're talking about cooperation and commonsism. And it's
Right,
just, it's just a via negativa way of getting there because it's the only way to get there. Anyway,
right.
I just think it's funny. Anyway,
Yeah,
so rather now that we've got a frame of this again, I always like to start these interviews off with the frame.
right.
Um, let's talk about your introduction to this chapter. What are you going to tell them?
All right. So again, just to reiterate, so biometrics, they never stop. They're always going. Our body is always taking signals, and our body's just always responding to stresses and stimulus and things like that. It's responding to its own internal stimulus as well, right? Our bodies just never stop working, right? There's always biometric responses going on. There's chemical releases, and there's the responses to those releases and things like that. And in the book itself, I go into, I provide lists of specific responses and what they're associated with and things like that. And we'll go into that a little bit as we discuss this here. The big thing that I really want listeners and readers of the book to recognize in this chapter is that all of the other situational awareness tools that I've provided instruction on are outwardly focused, and this one is outwardly focused as well. But this one also adds that internal component, and that's the big deviation from the other situational awareness and behavior analysis material. Is that this one I also really, and that's why I use the
Bring
examples that I
outer and
use.
inner together.
Yeah, that's why I use the examples I use in the book. Like I talk about, golfers that put themselves under stress to develop the ability to navigate that stress. What they're doing is they're trying to enhance their ability to navigate those biometric responses, so they have less of an impact on their golf game and things like that, right? So I'm using examples like that in this chapter specifically because I want to bridge that gap between the external and the internal, right? And that's not, and I don't want anyone to think that I'm saying dismiss the external, because these biometrics are absolutely a tool we can use to read people in our environments, right? Because they're automatically responding to the to the stimuli, just like our bodies automatically respond to the stimuli, right? So use that as a tool, but use your own responses as a tool for, to facilitate your safe navigation of your environment as well, right? So that's one of the big takeaways of this chapter, and one of the things that I don't know if people pick up on well when they're reading the chapters. I'm really trying to make a distinction here and try to tie that external with the internal processing
Mhm.
of this situational awareness, this piece. It's the other side, the other piece that I want people to take away of, and this repeats often when we're discussing this material. And I actually had an example come up this morning that I work in this field, right? So I see examples of this stuff all the time, but it was kind of a fun one this morning. So for the audience, I don't know if we've talked about this yet, but I have children and there's large age gaps between them, right? So like my oldest is turning 30 this year, my youngest is turning 5 this year, right? So there's huge age gaps between my kids. That's, I credit that with my ability to see some of the problems that I identify in the book, is because I'm engaged with these different
Oh, I
generational
see. Yes,
cohorts,
yes,
right?
yes.
Um, so I see this problem, these problems getting progressive over time. But back to the example and the context, just to provide context for the example I'm going to point to here is my son and I, we work out together, right? And so we work out at home. He's my training partner. We do our lifting together. We do our self-defense work together, stuff like that, right? He's about to turn 20, so he's he's not a child. He's an adult, but he's my training partner. So one of my younger daughters came downstairs into our workout space today, and we tend to wear the same types of things every day when we're working out, right? You have your workout clothes, right? Well, my son happened to be wearing a different shirt that he doesn't normally wear when he works out this morning. And so my daughter, she comes down to the workout space. She goes, "Why is he wearing that?" Right. And what it pointed out to me was that, here's this 6-year-old kid who's picking up on a deviation in her environment. She's doing exactly what our brains evolved to do. Now she's in a beneficial position in that she has not yet conditioned herself to dismiss that deviation.
Right. That's
train her brain to justify or make excuses for, or figure out a way to ignore it or anything like that. She's not conditioned herself to do that yet. So she's still very much in that, hey, that's a deviation and I need to pay attention to that frame. Being a 6-year-old. And the reason I like that as an example, and the reason why it struck me today, I wanted to include today, is because here's this little kid, this, no expectation of her, to be able to navigate the world or anything like that. And she's doing a better job of responding to her baseline plus anomaly equation than most adults can right now, because she's not getting in her own way about it. Right? She's recognizing that a deviation occurred, and she's questioning that deviation. And that's the repeated lesson in all of these situational awareness and behavioral analysis chapters is set a baseline so that you can recognize when an anomaly occurs, and then don't dismiss the anomaly. It doesn't mean you have to overly commit to the anomaly. Just don't dismiss it. Figure out why that anomaly is existing in that environment for you. And the same thing's true with these biometrics. Figure out why your body's responding to something. What has been triggered that's dumping adrenaline into your system? What's been triggered that's making you feel the beginnings of that fight or flight response? Right? Don't dismiss that. That's your body's trying to save your life. It may be wrong, but don't dismiss it. Get in the habit of engaging like that part of your brain is that 6-year-old going, hey, that's a weird thing in this environment. That's a pattern. That's a change from the pattern that I expect. Let's look at that change in the pattern and question it. So to me, it was just a great reinforcement and a great lesson that just emerged out of just our family interactions this morning.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So it was fun to see. Then from there, I go on to and that's not in the book, but I wanted to share it just to reinforce that, that's what we're trying to establish in these practices and these behaviors. Is just set a baseline so you can recognize deviations, and then don't dismiss the deviations. As far as the biometrics, one of the examples I like to use is, have you ever flinched? Right? That flinch response, that's not something you think of. That's not something that your brain processes, goes, hey, there's something flying at me. I need to get my arms up and intercept that thing flying at me. That's not what happens when you flinch. A flinch is an automatic response to a stimulus that was introduced too quickly. Right? You can't process it.
And I can't stand it.
Right. Well, but think about what the flinch is. It's you look at the analysis. They analyze people after they've been in car accidents that fly through their windshields. They almost always have trauma on their forearms because that flinch is so fast. Those arms get up and get in the way of the glass before the head can even hit the glass most of the time. Right? I mean, that's how fast.
Is there any difference between flinching and startle? What's the difference? I don't think there is.
Yeah, there's not. It's just how much time you have to respond to whatever the stimulus was. Is the only difference there. But it's the same response. But I mean, that's how fast
I startle easily. I don't flinch. I startle.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
But that's how quick our automatic systems can respond to a threat introduced. Right. And that's an evolved process. That's inherent to the way our systems work. Right. Yeah.
A second is pretty fast, right? I mean,
but and if you think about that, it's actually faster than any complex motor skill. So when somebody launches an attack at you, that flinch is actually faster so that you can get out in front of that attack. Right. So, but I like that just because it's an example of a biometric response that most people, it's not even on people's radar that's a biometric response. But I use that just to reinforce that your body is going to do these things. You can't stop your body. I mean, you can stop your body from doing these things, but when you're not consciously stopping your body from doing these things, they're going to automatically respond in these ways.
Right.
And it's not something that you have to do on purpose. It's not, it's not a thought process. Right. And so that's why this becomes a tool for us, because the people that we're observing, the same thing's happening inside their bodies. So that's kind of the introduction to the chapter. The next section, I provide an example, and this one, I hate talking about this guy because that's why I don't use the guy's name and stuff, because it's just a terrible thing.
Good. There's something good. There's something juicy in here.
Yeah, there's something. Well, yeah.
Are you telling us there's something juicy here?
Juicy is a little more descriptive than we want it. A word that we want to use here. So it's a story about something that happened when I was in boot camp, right, for the Marines. And so it didn't happen to me personally, but it happened to a Marine that I worked closely together with, right? Him and I were partnered together often. So I use him in the book here and there to describe different things. But this guy, when I was in, we did something called the slide for life, which you climb a giant tower and then you have to slide down a rope back down to ground level. But the thing's like a couple 100 feet in the air, and it's if you're upset by heights at all, it can be a very intimidating challenge to overcome. This guy's like before he came into the Marine Corps, he was a Golden Gloves amateur boxer, and I mean, this guy was just tough, right? He was just a really tough kid, right? Nobody knew it before this exercise occurred, but this guy was terrified of heights. And we get halfway up the tower, and I'm right behind him. They organize it by last names, right? So I'm like right behind him, right? And that's why we got paired together all the time. So I'm coaxing him up, trying to get him up to the top. We get up to the top, they start putting his harness on and stuff like that, and man, you could smell it. It was bad, right? And I felt bad for the guy putting his harness on, because this guy crapped himself. That's how scared of being up in this tower he was, that his bowels voided. No control. It wasn't something he chose to do, but his body just responded to this fear stimulus by evacuating all of his basically, man, it was terrible.
It's a good example because the fear of heights, because I have it, is a genetic. We can tell who's eating your genes. It's genetic. You don't have if you're really afraid of heights, it's not because you chose to be. You don't need a reason to be. You just are. Like, well,
yeah. And people are like, okay, so he crapped himself. But what is that? That your body, when it gets into a fear state like that, when it gets into that fight, flight, or freeze response, it's eliminating non-essential functions and keeping your colon clenched because you haven't gone to the bathroom in a while is a non-essential function when your life is in danger, right? So that's why people crap themselves when they're scared, right? It's just a biometric response. Your system just responds to a threat by pulling in resources away from non-essential functions. But yeah, I mean, it was the first time in my life I've actually seen or been near somebody who crapped themselves out of fear, right? I mean, I've seen people respond to fear before. I've responded to fear myself before, but it was the first time I actually saw somebody crap themselves out of fear. And it just happened to occur in Marine Corps boot camp. We were one of the toughest guys I've ever met in my life, right? So to me, it just illustrates a perfect example of how our bodies respond to these things. And, no amount of tough guyism or no amount of, being a hard ass or anything like that stops your body from responding to these stimulus, to these signals, to these threats. And so that's why I use that example in the book. I think it illustrates really well how biometrics operate and what it means that they operate, right? So the next section, why am I talking about biometrics now? And we covered this a little bit, right? So biometrics is the final piece in our baseline plus anomaly equals decision equation. Right? It's that last step in that process. So we started with the overall environment, looking for those shifts. Then we shrunk it down to the proxemics. Then we shrunk it down again from there if we picked up on anything into the kinesics. And this is that last step here. It's the biometrics, and it's that fourth piece of the puzzle, that fourth tool to use in that baseline plus anomaly equals decision process, right? So what is biometrics? We hear a lot of talk about it now in things like fingerprinting to get into your computers and stuff like that. And so the term gets used in a lot of different ways. For my purpose, biometrics is our body's physiological responses to external stimuli, right? And the internal emotional states. That's how I use the term biometrics in the book, and that's how I use the term as I presented.
I wondered why you chose that term. That's okay. It makes sense.
Right. So they're the automatic mechanisms our bodies use to prepare the system for freeze, flight, or fight, right? So
When we were warming up, you had a hard time saying autonomic.
yes,
It's like some people have a problem with nuclear. I still can't figure out why. Like Peter Zeihan, who's a really smart guy who knows a lot of stuff, can't say it correctly. I just find it really funny. And it's just autonomic is actually one of those things that you want to say it differently,
right.
right?
Well, it's part of the reason I go back and forth there is because I don't like to assume the context of my audience. So sometimes I'll use automatic, and sometimes I'll use autonomic.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to, I'm not trying to
use the big word with me because that's
right.
Okay with me.
Yeah.
Okay,
So my head thinks autonomic, but I often present it to an audience as automatic.
Yes, that's
So
smart. I was just trying to figure if I could get a joke in there somewhere.
Yeah, no, it's funny. The just for framing purposes, I tie in here that biometrics are tied very tightly to our needs, right? Our need for food and shelter and water, all those things. Those are stimulus, those are stress stimuli that our body is automatically responding to, right? Because a lot of what I talk about throughout the book is addressing how do we facilitate the provision of our own needs, right? So that's the whole other side of the material. It's outside of the situational awareness stuff is the fieldcraft stuff for needs provisioning, right? So these are very much tied together. And I try to do that throughout the situational awareness stuff because all of these tools are also used in the provision of needs, right? So that it's very much tied together. The other reason that that's important is because needs are common across all humans. So the autonomic responses that are responding to threats to needs are common across all humans. That's why this stuff is useful to us, right? These aren't cultural phenomenon. These aren't contextual phenomenon. They're universal phenomenon across
universal
all
biological functions.
Right, exactly. Then the next section, I go on a little bit about how the midbrain works, just a layman's overview of the components involved in biometric responses, right? In this section, I
changed the
introduced.
F word.
Yes, I did.
I didn't learn it with fornication.
Nope, me neither. But I get it. I want this book accessible to children. Now, most of those children these days happen to be adult aged, but I still want this book to be accessible to children. So here I introduce another rule of thumb. I like to use these throughout the book just because they help, the memorization, the memory sticking of this material, right? So here I introduce the 5 Fs, this process, which are food, fornication, fight, flight, and freeze, right? Those are the big categories that impact our autonomic responses, our biometric responses to stress or threats, right? So the base level needs our bodies physiologically respond to, right, in a way that can be observed. And that's the important part, is that these ones produce observable physiological responses, right? The next section, I get into a little bit about the chemical brain dump that happens, right? So our limbic system, it's more sensitive than our conscious awareness. Again, it does start to dump chemicals into our system. It dumps that adrenaline, it dumps that cortisol, it dumps that dopamine into our system. All of those serve functions, right, to increase heart rate or dilate our blood vessels or make us more resilient to pain, like dopamine and stuff like that. It's reducing our pain response and stuff like that, countering our pain response so that we can continue to fight through something if we end up in a fight situation, right? So all these chemicals are playing roles in our fight, flight, freeze response, right? So they're responding to our needs. And that same thing is true of not just us, but whoever represents a threat to us. When they're getting ready to attack somebody, their body is also going through those same processes. Their body is dumping those chemicals into their system in preparation for that fight or flight or freeze that they're encountering, right? So it's not just us that this is happening to, and we can pick up on those cues, right? So then the next section is about that, right? We start getting into the common biometric cues, right? So I introduce some of the general cues and get more specific about what those cues are tied to. And I go through a bunch of lists of different cues in here that we don't need to cover in this. They're all in the book, right? So like the first one is emotional cues, right? And so these are the physiological responses to emotional states that are common across all people, right? Things like anger and fear and stuff like that, they produce a physiological response in our system, right? I mean, if you see somebody getting red in the face and you see their nostrils flaring and you see they start breathing faster, right? And you see blood vessels popping out, I don't even have to tell you the word I'm describing, and you know what emotion that person's in, right? It's the same thing. If you've ever heard,
you never get angry, do you, Luke?
I try to keep a lid on my anger, right? So, but all of our emotions have or produce or have the potential to produce physiological response. You think joy, you think happiness, you think embarrassment, you think fear, you think anger, you think disgust. all of those things are going to produce a physiological response in our system, because our system is biologically responding to those signals and preparing ourselves to respond to the source of disgust, the source of anger, the source of fear, the source of happiness, the source of joy. You talked earlier about the good-looking woman, right? That's your body's going to respond to that in preparation of what occurs next in that interaction, right? So, I mean, these physiological responses just happen. They're just automatic. Yeah.
So, are you trying in this chapter to make reasonable, practical, and predictable understanding of what your body's doing, or what your body's doing and what other people's body? I mean, I get this in the hierarchy, but I want to contextualize it for the audience.
My focus here is always on what you can observe in others. That's why I limit my lists to the observable physiological changes.
Right.
It's not an exhaustive list of all the things that are changing. I just want the reader to keep in mind that if they're feeling that any kind of change in their own system, that's a trigger to look for something.
So it is both then, right?
Yeah, it is both. But my focus in the lists that I use, those specific ones, examples I use, are because these are the observable phenomenon. Like, so I mentioned fear in here. Have you ever heard the term, you look like you've seen a ghost?
Yes.
Right. That's somebody describing a physiological response, a biometric response, right? Because as you experience fear, your capillaries restrict. And so the blood leaves your extremities, so they can be put into your heart, into your lungs, and the things that are required for running away. Right. So you actually pale when you're scared. And that's what they mean when they say you look like you've seen a ghost. You get that ashen look on your face. Right. And so that's just another example of one of these physiological responses that you can see. If you see somebody walking through an environment and everybody else looks normal and they look pale, that person is under a fear stress.
Yes.
Right. So stuff like that. And all of these states have specific physiological responses that are observable that they produce, right? They mix and match, and there's overlap and things like that. Our bodies are complex things, right? But there's some pretty distinct ones that you can see and you can pick up on, that are tied pretty closely to certain emotions, right? Now, the next section, does it fit? And here I reinforce and reiterate for the user that what we're looking for is deviations from what's expected, deviations from our baseline, right? We can use this in a lot of different ways, but for the purposes of the material as I'm presenting it, I'm trying to build in you the practice of looking for, identifying, and questioning the deviations. Right? Build the baseline so that you can recognize the anomaly. And so I repeat that over and over again as I go through the situational awareness material. That's because that's the real practice here that I'm trying to help you develop.
Right.
Right. And once you get into that practice, it becomes applicable all over the place, whether you're engaging on social media or you're dealing with actual physical threats. Once you get in the practice of,
but we can't reach through the screen and do what we want to people.
Right. Well, that would make a lot of things much easier.
It really would. It would re-civilize conversation really quickly.
Yeah. But that, I include that here just because I want people to be aware that biometrics, like all the other aspects of situational awareness, requires the practice of establishing baselines so that you can identify anomalies. And that's, again, I beat that drum through the whole book because it's super important. That's what this whole practice that we're developing here with this stuff is. We don't need to know everything about everything when it comes to reading situations, threats, stuff. We just need to be able to set a baseline so that we can identify anomalies and not dismiss them. Find out what doesn't fit. Right. You look at that. Some of the examples I use are, that guy who's super red in the face at a kid's puppet show. That should be a warning to you about something, or at least get your attention.
Right.
That's incongruent with the environment, within the context. Right. That's something that should be a trigger for you to as you're assessing an environment. That woman who looks pale and is breathing heavily when everyone around her is just casually walking to their next lecture. Something is going on there to create that biometric response. Right. And that I would suggest or recommend deserves at least a little bit of your attention if you're seeing that kind of deviation, right? The other side is, because this is that last step, this is that most dialed in view of what's going on around you. By the time you're reading biometric cues, you already should have a lot of indicators that something is amiss, right? Something led you to start looking at the biometric level of threat detection. So what we're doing is we're adding to an accumulation of of signals, an accumulation of cues that something in your environment deserves your attention, right? So if you get to the point where you're recognizing biometric changes, it's time to really take action. You're not in the gathering data state anymore. You're in the, you need to start
Especially
acting.
times.
Right. Yeah. And the other side of it is I don't spend a lot of time on specifically on reading facial expression and facial biometrics. But that's because by the time you're that close, you're in the threat. You're not avoiding the threat anymore. You're in the threat.
Right.
But that's why that's why I say here that by the time you're at the level of biometric cues, you need to be moving into action.
Yes. In other words, don't wait till the cue is no longer necessary because the action is obvious.
Right. Exactly. Right. It stops being informative. But yeah, and through all the training I go through and stuff like that, the standard we use and what I express is that 70% decision now is way better than that 100% decision too late.
Yes.
Right. So we're looking for a good decision, not the ideal decision or the perfect decision. Right. And it's okay to be wrong. If you get yourself out of there and turns out there wasn't a threat, you still didn't encounter a threat.
That's right.
Right. So in the practice of this, just look for decisions that drive action, right? You really want to get into the practice of reaching a decision that drives an action, reaching a decision that drives the action. And that's the practice that you're developing here. So the next section, I talk a little bit about the parasympathetic backlash, right? And this is the other side. This is the other side of the hormone dump, right? So we dump hormones into our system and it causes all of these physiological responses, right? Now, when you get through that process, those hormones start flushing out of your system, and that creates a whole new set of physiological responses that are also observable. And you can see in like if you look at like after the towers collapsed, the 9/11 and stuff, if you're looking at the crowd, you can see them cycling through the autonomic responses and then the parasympathetic backlash, and the autonomic response and parasympathetic backlash. And they're cycling through the stuff as they're exposed to different stresses and different stresses and different stresses. And they're getting more and more wasted as they go through these dumps and flushes of these chemicals running through their system. And all of those things are producing these biometric responses. And a lot of them are observable, right? You see people shaking.
You wonder what what can I tell you? I can tell abstractly that, when you're in a gunfight, right? I guarantee you, and I'm pretty numb, and I guarantee you that backlash will kick your ass. And that's why I'm always I look at these cops that have been, I'm like, no, he's not, the person isn't back yet because of what's going on.
Well, and I don't know if you experience it, but a lot of people experience this after their first violent encounter. They will throw up after it's done.
Yes.
And that's part of that parasympathetic backlash. That's part of their system flushing out all of those chemicals that were dumped into their system.
Yeah.
Right? It's such an abrupt change in their homeostasis that their body responds by vomiting, by getting rid of whatever's in there, just because it has to move. It's just such a shock to the system. So I use that parasympathetic backlash as another category of cues that we can watch out for, right? Because depending on where, a potential threat is in their process of cycling through their operation of threat, right? They could be in an adrenaline state, or they could be in an adrenaline dump state. And both of those are telling us something, right? Depending on how long it's been since they started their action. Like if it's the bomber that planted the bomb 5 minutes ago and he's still in the area, 10 minutes later waiting for it to go off. He's not necessarily going to be in that heightened adrenaline state. He could very well be in that parasympathetic backlash state already, right? And so we can start to pick up on those signals. And it's the same sort of things you see. It's just they kind of emerge as the opposite of whatever the initial trigger was, right? So if you're flushing,
everything else you've described before this has been relatively easy to understand.
Yeah.
I actually think this is hard, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, that's why I have to build the foundation of everything else before we get to this one. That's why I don't like to start with this one, because this one kind of extracts from everything else. It's a tough one, but it's also and I don't say this dismissively. It's also because of where it lands in the stack, it's the least necessary to be the most accurate about.
Oh, I see. That's smart.
Right.
Right.
Because by the time we're here, you've had a lot of other opportunities to pick up on signals
Right.
before we got here. So yeah, it's probably the most complex and probably takes the most nuance to learn how to do accurately, but it's the least important to be the most accurate about.
Mhm.
So
You know, people, the more aggression they feel, the more focused their behavior,
mhm.
the more relaxed people are, the more, you know, casual their demeanor.
Right.
Then you get somebody that's really paying attention to something, that's not a good thing. Especially if it's you.
Right.
But so it's, I think it's, the reason I'm saying that is because what do you, that's, you address that in a different area. What you addressed that before, biometrics. That's a behavioral thing, right?
Yeah, in the kinesics, in the body
Right.
language section. Yeah.
But this one, boy, I would have a hard time, other than, wow, if you see somebody coming, if somebody just got out of a car accident, sometimes they're not there.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely. Well,
Right.
and some of the responses, they can be big responses. Like if somebody's yawning inappropriately, that means they had some sort of chemical flush going through their system. Right, where now their responses, they're just starting to yawn, where they weren't before. A few minutes before they weren't yawning, and now they are yawning. Right, that means that something shifted inside them. Right, if you're seeing inappropriate lethargy, if you're seeing disorientation that wasn't there before, this stuff is all all a manifestation of these biometric responses. One of the things that you mentioned, being in a gunfight before, one of the things that happens to the person engaged in violent conflict is that tunnel vision.
Yes.
Right? Now it's not observable, so I don't go over it much in the book because it's not something we can observe, but it's something that occurs to anyone. I mean, you talk to anybody that's been in combat, you talk to any cops that have been involved in shieldouts or whatever, they all get that tunnel vision. Even that's one of the reasons why testimony is valued less than hard evidence, is because that tunnel vision restricts what witnesses actually see. So just observing a
Yes.
terrible incident, one of the stress reactions that your body performs is you get that tunnel vision, right? You focus on the threat. That's just one of the automatic responses that our bodies do when confronted with a
Yeah,
threat. Is it
absolutely.
forces your attention on that threat? So a lot of this stuff, there's a lot more that goes on even than what I cover in biometrics. But again, my focus is on what are observable, you know, from others. What things can you actually pick up on as cues? And that's kind of what I finish with here, is that the biometric cues, they're tied to our physiological and psychological needs, right? So our body's responding to those things. When our needs are being met, our body essentially maintains a normal state, an equilibrium, right? So our bodies function in that equilibrium.
I like the idea. I mean, I know it's externally focused, but I like the idea that maybe you should listen to your body when it's effing talking to you,
Yeah,
because
yeah,
it is filtering out all that stuff. It is telling you, hey, you need to pay attention to this. Because sometimes you just get, I mean, women are notorious for finding things creepy or whatever, right? Right. To me, just sometimes I'll just like, what's bugging me? It's because somebody's behaving at the edge of my peripheral vision. Somebody's behaving in a way that I don't like.
right.
Right. I wasn't even conscious of being aware of that person until that
Right.
happened.
Yeah.
So I like the idea of
My
pay attention, pay it. Your autonomic responses are a form of observation,
yes, absolutely. That's a
right? I mean,
fantastic way of putting it. Yeah. Yeah.
the-
What?
they're they are, and you should not be overly confident that you're, yeah. However, you should listen to what your body's telling you,
Yeah.
and
Trust your gut.
not narrate yourself into sedation. Is that the right?
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. One of the my fear coach, he's a guy named Tony Blauer, right? It's one of the things he focuses on is just how to navigate fear. And I use that because I incorporated it into a lot of what I teach. Um, he identifies a process of what he calls the three I's, right? And it's a process we work through when we're developing these capacities, right? And it's instinct, intuition, and intelligence. Those are what we process this stuff through.
Correct.
and we want to get faster and better at processing this whole process from instinct, intuition, and intelligence, right? We want to tie them together as much as we can, so that we're not, when they're detached from each other, that's what exposes us to vulnerabilities. That's when we miss the threat. But as we tie them together, each of them becomes more accurate.
Yes.
And each of them becomes more proportionate. And that's what we're trying to build with a lot of this stuff, is we're trying to tie together that instinct, that intuition, and that intelligence into a full suite of tools that facilitate our successful navigation of our environments. Right? So I think, I just think stuff like that's very valuable, no matter whether we're talking about threats or not. I think building this stuff is very valuable. So.
I was listening to you, and I'm thinking about it, and you were saying it's externally focused, but I'm like, I understand that, but that internal is just an external focus.
Yes.
Right. Your body's telling you things that you should listen to.
Yes.
And I was thinking about when I'm sitting there on the floor with my 9mm in my lap, and there's cops everywhere, and they're like, "Are you okay?" And I'm like, "I'm not going to be okay for a while."
Right. Yes.
Right.
And that's absolutely accurate, because you're not.
Because I'm literally I'm shaking, and I can only see this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, it just felt like it was horrible. I don't know. I know that guys that do it in the military context, you get exhausted from it, right? You just get exhausted from that.
Yeah.
And because if it happens repeatedly, it just kicks your whatever.
Yes. Hard.
What?
Yeah, it kicks it hard. Yeah. Yeah, but that's it's a very accurate way to frame it and way to view it, right? Our body responds to changes in our environment, and ignoring that response is like ignoring something that a threat that you see. It's no different. Again, it's just another one of our senses, right? That we ought to be utilizing, ought to be leveraging. So I think that's a fantastic way to approach it, right? And that's biometrics.
So did we cover what you wanted to?
Yeah, we covered what I wanted to. It's a tool.
I find this one more interesting than I expected.
Yeah, it's a tool for observation, but it's not just an external tool for observation. That's kind of the big takeaway from biometrics, and it's incorporated into our overall stack of situational awareness tools. But it's also that kind of last step in that process, in that stack.
What joys? We've only got 4 chapters left, right?
4 chapters left.
What joys confront us in the coming chapters?
So the next one,
it's like Act 3. What's the surprise here?
Right. Well, so the next one, not everyone sees coming, right? So the next one is hygiene, right? And we don't necessarily. That's not the first thing that comes to mind when we talk about our needs being met, but you can't not do hygiene, right?
No. And modern life makes you take it for granted.
Yeah, absolutely.
And if you ever go to a primitive village somewhere, you will notice the difference.
Yes, hygiene is the only time in the book where I actually quote the Bible. and most people don't even recognize that a Bible quote can be pulled out about hygiene, but it's in there, right? So then after hygiene, we get into an overview, an overall summary of situational awareness. Right, so we review the entire process of situational awareness in chapter 14. 15, I talk specifically about fear, right, and about harnessing fear and navigating fear. And then chapter 16 is the summary, the resummation of the book and representation of the initial arguments and concepts, and hopefully with a new understanding for the reader after they've been through the material. So,
well, now once we finish that, we got to get you to write another book.
That's what we're looking at. So,
you suppose we'll be doing Noah will do his book with us?
Oh, that'd be fun. That'd be cool to do. Yeah.
Yeah, it'd be fun.
Yeah.
Would you sit in on that if we did?
I would sit in on that. Yeah. I think Noah's work is very valuable, and I think my work naturally progresses into his work very, very easily. I think so.
That's why I think it would be fun to do that together.
Yeah, absolutely.
And how many books has he got? He's got 2 out now.
2 that I'm aware of. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So it might be fun. All right. I love you, man. Thanks for the joy. I hope we. I don't know what our actual time was on this one.
I don't know either. Again, it's the Primal Primer. It's available in all the online bookstores, Barnes and Noble, Amazon, all that kind of stuff. You can get everywhere. All versions are available, right? It's in hard copy, soft copy, electronic, audiobook. There's even a video book out there if you want me to read it to you. If you want to fall asleep to me reading the book to you. So I will be attaching these videos to the video book once we're complete with the whole series, just so that anybody watching those has this as reference material as they go through that material as well. So.
All right. Love you, man.
Yep.
See you next week.
Thanks for everything.